right, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. Thank you for rating and reviewing us on iTunes. Thank you for supporting us at patreon.com/Matt Lewis. Happy to welcome today Alexandra Hudson. Her new series is called Storytelling and the Human Condition. You can find out more about that at alexandraohudson.com. She's also the author of the forthcoming, actually, it's out, right?
Book's coming out October 10th.
The forthcoming book, I was right. It's called The Soul of Civility. Check it out. Alexandra Hudson, welcome to the news.
Thanks for having me, Matt.
Great to talk with you. So I'm fascinated by storytelling. I think it's something we probably don't think enough of. I was reading a book years ago, and it was about seeing a doctor. And apparently, doctors get sued for malpractice if they mess up. But apparently there's no correlation between being a good doctor and getting sued. The correlation is between whether you listen to the patient or not. And the problem is that the way patients tell stories, if you're a doctor and I came in, I wouldn't say my spleen I would say like, well, I got up this morning and I went out to get the mail and the newspaper's not there. So I bend over and, oh, I've got this pain. And you're telling the story. And if the doctor's not listening and respecting the story, that's a problem. So stories are really important, but you tell me what inspired you to get involved in this project?
It's really funny, to your point on that opening anecdote. That's one reason I've heard why there's such a gravitational pull towards more holistic medicine and like alternative medicine. It's because the perception is that doctors at the big bureaucratic hospitals are just like, let's get to the next, and a more holistic practitioner will sit down and be like, tell me your life story and tell you theirs. Even it's just more of like they feel more seen and more personable, more personal. But that's great. So I was raised on good storytelling. My father's a filmmaker. He's a children's book author. He's a cinematographer. And every night, my father would tell my brothers and I stories about his childhood. And we would always say, what happened next, Dad? Tell us a story when you were little. And we would pause. What happened next? And it wasn't until we were just riveted by all of this motley crew from his childhood, his neighborhood in Portland, Maine. He went to Catholic school. There was Butch the Bully. There was Greg Fenton, who was this kind of lanky guy who was underestimated. He was always underestimated. He was kind of like, not the brightest tool in the shed, not the brightest kid in the block. Sorry to mix my metaphors. And people always tried to take advantage of him, and he always came out on top. And then there was Sister Maureen, who she wore a ruler around her waist and was unafraid to use the ruler. This is in the day when corporal punishment at Catholic schools was was permissible. And anyway, we were just riveted by all these stories, growing up these crazy characters from his childhood. And it wasn't until I was creating this series on storytelling that my father confided in me a secret, that most of the stories he told us about his childhood growing up weren't true. They'd never happened. And I was like, at first I was like, what? Like, how could that be? And then I was like, you know what? It didn't matter, because they were incredible bonding experiences. Like there were hours, countless thousands of hours of our childhood growing up, just like, gathered around the hearth of my father's storytelling. And they instilled in us, they kind of provided a sort of moral framework for how we saw the world growing up. And those were, that hard work is rewarded. Those were some like recurring themes. One with the character of Greg Fenton was, if you can't beat someone, like it's not a fair fight, like be clever and diffuse unkindness with cleverness and wittiness. And so just like all of these values that, were much more effective than just a list of rules of do's and don'ts, right? They were kind of provided for us organically over a generation really of storytelling. And now it's a huge gift to be able to do that with my son now every night. And sometimes during the day, constantly, he's like, Mom, tell me a story. He always wants a story. Like we are primed. There's something in our DNA that is just riveted by stories. And research out of Princeton University has shown that the brain waves of a storyteller and a story listener literally sync when a story is being told. And so we know that it's an effective form of communication. It's all anyone ever remembers when you're talking. And I think this series, what I'm so thrilled about is that I just hope that anyone who enjoys it, who takes the time to go through it, will help us just really understand the power of storytelling and how people across history and culture have harnessed its remarkable power to help them ask and answer big questions in their lives and help them lead better lives. Questions of origin, purpose, and destiny. Who are we? Why are we here? What is the best way to live? Every culture has reflected on these questions and answered them through storytelling. And it's a rich goldmine of wisdom that I definitely think we can use and benefit from today.
Absolutely. A lot there to discuss. Like you, my dad used to tell me stories. And there's a cliche about like Uncle Leroy and another one of his stories. They're so boring, but no, we want to hear stories. If you go into a speech and someone's like, I want to start by telling you a story. It's kind of like when you're a little kid and they wheel a projector into your classroom. You're like, yes,
Yes,
this is good. I
exactly.
want. We think in stories. We like to hear stories. And so I think if you are a public speaker or a book author, by the way, writing more stories as opposed to like let me tell you what I think. If you can do it in the form of a story, very effective. So a lot there to digest. I do want to ask you because something you said um, strikes me about modern day politics. I talk a lot about politics here, and that is having a story about who we are. And right now in America, there's a populist moment, a nationalist moment. Even though we are experiencing pretty much peace and prosperity that is unparalleled in human history, people don't feel like they're that happy. And I think part of it is that we don't have a common story. What do you think about that?
I think that's a great insight. We lack a shared narrative, and we yearn for a shared narrative. Every culture has a sort of an earth story, an origin story, or a founding myth. And we have a founding myth, but often the founding myths of a culture are part and parcel with a culture's epic poem. We don't really have an epic poem. Homer did that for the Greeks in the form of the Odyssey and the Iliad. Virgil did that in the form of the Aeneid. There's the Chanson de Roland in the French tradition. John Milton, the poet, wrote Paradise Lost. He wanted that to be the myth of not just the English people, but also humankind. That's a story about the fall of mankind and man's fall from grace in the Garden of Eden. And I once posted a Twitter post, a question, what is America's myth? What's our epic poem? And I got 1,000 plus responses, and none of them were the same. I mean, maybe there were a few that were like Walt Whitman, maybe some that said Moby Dick, but it's like, how many kids today are reciting Walt Whitman or Herman Melville's Moby Dick by heart? Like it doesn't have the same sort of cultural resonance that Virgil would have had to the ancient Romans, for example, and it doesn't provide the same sort of moral grid, the sort of moral framework that these other poems would have done. And so one thing I've thought about, like, does to some extent the Marvel cinematic universe provide that? Like, there's no consensus, virtually no consensus about what our kind of epic found myth is in terms of an epic poem, but we still hunger for that. We hunger for that shared narrative. And I mean, just to talk about politics for a second, it won't surprise anyone that Donald Trump was a really powerful storyteller. He told an effective story about where things went wrong and who was to blame and what the solution was. And the solution was to vote for him, and you would be standing up for yourself, and you would be voting for someone and reclaiming your agency, and that would be and voting for someone who would fight for you and take on the bad guy, the person, people who are blameworthy on your behalf because you've been downtrodden and overlooked. And that was a powerful story. I think people don't like to, that's what I think we miss, rather, that stories are being told around us all the time, every day. Even if it's not a, once upon a time kind of story, it's a narrative about who we are as human beings, a vision of the good, and a path forward, a path towards the good life. Those are all stories that are being told around us all the time. And I think as listeners, we need to be critical story listeners as well. We were talking about a second ago, you and I were both raised on stories. We yearn for that. We go immediately into passive, like gleeful bliss as soon as we're, being told a story. But what does it look like to be critical of stories as well, especially when they're wrong. Really quickly, in Aristotle's traditional framework of rhetoric, there are three parts of a good rhetorician. There is ethos, pathos, and logos. So ethos is character. What is the character of the person speaking? Can you trust them? And then there is logos. Logos is reason or rationality. Is what they're saying true? Is it corroborable? Is it valid? And then there's pathos, and that's emotion, that's storytelling. And I think too easily we stay at the level of pathos. Like, is this something we want to hear? And we don't assess the logos or ethos of the person telling the story. And so just talking about the responsibility as us as story listeners, I think it behooves us to be more critical and thinking of all that fully encompassing vision of what is good rhetoric and good storytelling.
People people watch movies and TV shows and read novels for entertainment purposes. Sometimes they're thrillers, sometimes it's titillating. There's different reasons why people do that. But I have to say, I think it's also practicing and rehearsing experiences that haven't happened to you yet, giving you wisdom and experience. And I have to say also, there's a sense in today's modern world that we live in that everything is so progressive and weird and postmodern. But, a lot of the old fashioned values come through. I was just watching have you seen the movie Tar?
I haven't watched it yet. It's on my list because it's a nominee for the Academy Awards. So I'd love to. How was it?
So I think it's good. It's weird, but essentially it's about this woman who is at the top of her game. She's very powerful, and she kind of forgets where she came from, and she starts exploiting that power a little bit, and then she goes through like a cancel culture type experience,
Mm-hmm.
right? So like that, you tell me, but it's like flying too close to the sun,
That's right.
something like that, right? And then I was just listening to the Rewatchables podcast with Bill Simmons. A movie similar to Tar that came out, 10 or 15 years ago was Whiplash. About the kid who's like the drummer, and he's being pushed really hard by his teacher, probably too hard. And then it raises this question, which is, to be great, to be one of the best in your business, do you have to be willing to do everything or do anything, and even be humiliated, be beaten or abused by a mentor, or is that crossing the line? And the movie Whiplash doesn't really answer that question, but I think it's a good thing for us to struggle with. And I have a 12-year-old and a 10-year-old, and like those are conversations. At some point, I'll show them that movie, and we'll have that discussion. So it presents an opportunity for us to gain wisdom. It's not just entertainment. It's not wasted. We are rehearsing things that haven't happened to us yet that very well could happen in real life.
That's exactly right. And stories allow us to reap the benefits, kind of psychologically, emotionally, physiologically, even of success, of good things that happen to people because of our mirror neurons. Like we empathize, like we experience that joy of other people's joy when we see that on screen or read it in a book, and we are able to suffer the consequences of flying too close to the sun, of pride, of vice, without actually experiencing those sometimes irreparable consequences ourselves. So you're absolutely right. Thank you for that nod to classical history to the idea that there is wisdom in storytelling, and that nod to pride. Of course, pride being the pivotal theme in that story of Icarus that you just alluded to in Greek mythology. There's this great story from African mythology I'd love to share about pride. So there's this great character called Anansi from African mythology. He's a character from the Ashanti people of Ghana. And he's the original Spider-Man. Often in this oral tradition, in this lore, he emerges as a spider, and he's crafty and he's wily. And so that's kind of fun, that vision of like the original Spider-Man coming from Africa. So there's this one story where Anansi decided that he wanted to collect the world's wisdom and be the wisest person in the world. So he collected it all and put it in a big cauldron, a big soup pot. And he asks his son, he says, okay, now help me take all the world's wisdom, and I'm going to hide it on top of this tallest tree that I can find. So he and his son start climbing this tree, and they have this huge cauldron full of the world's wisdom. And all of a sudden, it starts to fall. The cauldron, and his son says, "Oh, I know what you should do. Let's tie a rope around you, and we'll get you up to the tree, and then pull it up afterwards, so it doesn't fall and spill the world's wisdom." So they get the world's wisdom to the top of the tree, and then Anansi has this realization. He said, "I had the world's wisdom in my little cauldron, or my big cauldron here. And yet here was my son who was still able to offer me advice. How is that possible?" And he had this like moment of, pride turned humility when he realized he actually didn't contain the world's wisdom and never truly could. That this sort of wisdom of the human tradition is a custodian that we all share that. And so he instead dumped out the cauldron of the world's wisdom, and it went spread all over to everyone. And that is why, Matt, everyone has a little bit of wisdom and nobody has all of it.
So true. Well, let me ask you a little bit about you. I heard you were like hit by a car when you were 4 years old. Is this true?
When I was 4, I was frog hunting. This was one of my favorite pastimes in my younger self. And to be honest, today, if I saw like what I thought could be fertile ground for frog hunting, I might pull up my pants and go for a jaunt these days. But I haven't frog hunted in a long time. I used to just love hunting frogs. I loved it. I would always release them afterwards. And one day I had this incredible catch, really the biggest bullfrog of my frog hunting career. And when I should have been napping, I disobeyed my mother, and I took my prize and ran across the street to share it with my friends. I couldn't wait to share it with them, this prize. And in my zeal, I did not look both ways before I crossed the street, as my mother, of course, had told me to do 1,000,000 times before. And out of nowhere, a truck hit me. I went flying, hit my head. My femur was broken. Ambulance came. I remember being strapped onto a stretcher and being put into the back of an ambulance and asking, "Where's my frog? Where did my frog go?" And there's a photo somewhere in our family archives of like me and this just huge bullfrog with like my head wrapped in bandages and me strapped to a stretcher. And ended up spending the rest of that summer in traction. I'd broken my right femur and of course had hit my head from impact, like on the concrete. And doctors told me that I might never walk or run normally again. I was unclear. I might have brain damage. That was not clear as well. And I now tell this story to my son all the time. He's now 3, Percy. And of course, we're at the age where I don't want him running the street without holding my hands. That's a value. And I tell him this story, both as a cautionary tale of what happens when you don't obey your parents. And also, I don't end on just the level of trauma, though. I tell him, we are people of faith. We're Christians, and I tell him, God protected me for a reason, and I was able to go on, and I played varsity soccer in college and all the sports in high school, and I turn it into a story of like purpose and redemption, and I hope that models for him how he can do that with what will inevitably be traumas and hardship in his own life as well, that we don't have to keep the bad things that happen to us at the level of this is really sad and tragic, that we and how we shape the narrative, how we recast it and retell it both to ourselves and to other people, how that's healing and ultimately redemptive. So I hope that that's something that he can do in his own life as well. It's also resilience, cultivating resilience too.
Someone said, be the hero in your own story.
That's
Do you
right.
think that's true?
I think that when it comes to our personal narratives, we have to be, and we have to tell ourselves empowering narratives. One of the most inspiring parts of one of my favorite parts of this very famous book called "The Body Keeps the Score," about how trauma affects the brain, is about how people can heal from trauma by imagining alternative scenarios. So imagine a child who is brutally raped growing up, but imagining that having like projecting the child actually stopping her perpetrator and saying, no, that's not going to happen ever again. And how that just recasting the narrative in our minds of agency and autonomy and power and showing courage in the face of adversity, that obviously doesn't negate the trauma having happened, but at least helps us cope with it in a way by reframing those early traumas in empowering ways.
I hear you say that, and I'm thinking Once Upon a Time in Hollywood.
That's great. I love that movie as
where
well.
of course the ending, instead of Sharon Tate being murdered by the Manson family, they go to they go to the other house next door, and it's a Green Beret
Brad Pitt, yeah,
who has a dog who's been well
right.
trained apparently. So that's an example, right? Quentin Tarantino wrote that. Um, is it helpful? This horrible thing. I mean, the Manson murders were a big deal, and I think a lot of people think they ended the 1960s. That they ruined the dream of peace, of the summer of love and all that stuff, and rewriting the story and having the good guys win. I think it's cathartic.
I think probably. I think it raises another point about what happens when stories are lost to history. Like I was not born in the 60s, putting all my card on the table. So my husband and I, who was not also born in the 60s, we were watching that movie and like reading Wikipedia articles about Sharon Tate's murder while it's going on. Because I mean, the way he filmed it, it's like it's time stamped, right? It's like date and time stamp. So I'm like, okay, like I wasn't there. Like what was going on that day and that time? And so it was really interesting to learn about a really pivotal cultural tragedy that I knew nothing about or very
Oh, so
little about.
you weren't that familiar with the Manson murders or anything
I
like that?
wasn't. No, I actually
Yeah,
wasn't. Yeah.
that's because you're younger than me. So when I was a kid, um, there was this uh, book called Helter Skelter that was
Mhm.
really famous, which was about the Manson murders, and you couldn't escape it. It was on TV everywhere. And Squeaky Fromm, who was one of the girls, one of the Manson family girls, she's in the movie. She tried to kill President Ford. Do you know about this? It's
No.
crazy. Yeah, she tried to assassinate President Ford in like 1977 or something. I don't know, 78, and failed obviously. Um, so this was like in the zeitgeist at the time. It was unescapable. But so I think the problem would be if someone sees Once Upon a Time in Hollywood and then believes that's the real story, that's what really happened, as opposed to, for me, it's the cathartic experience where I've been inundated with the tragedy, and now I get to see
Ah.
the alternative ending, which is.
Was it healing for you, Matt? Did you feel like there was redemption there from
Yeah,
that?
I mean, look, don't get me wrong. I wasn't like obsessed with Manson, and you know, it wasn't a burden on me in my
Oh,
life. But it
you're,
was there with, like, the space, the shuttle Challenger disaster,
yeah.
and you know, I don't know, like leaving Saigon and abandoning people. It was like one of the things that one of the bad things that went wrong in my lifetime that kind of hurt America and was a little bit scary. And
Mhm.
so, yes, to have a movie with an alternate ending, I think was refreshing and cathartic.
And I think that's why films like about the Flight 93, averted flight during 9/11. Like I think that's why those are so powerful because it's like people who did avert some crisis, and mitigate some aspect of that broad cultural crisis. Because I was thinking of what are analogous traumas, like cultural traumas in my memory. Like I was alive during 9/11, and that was a huge moment. It's still like a defining moment in our history today. But just to have that, even to entertain that idea, like what if more passengers had been able to do that? Like what damage could have been averted? Like that kind of alternate, just entertaining that, I think is fascinating and yeah, potentially healing. But thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, and I also like stories with heroes, right? Um, and I know nowadays we have like anti-heroes, and it's not as black and white as it once was, but telling stories about things that are heroic, in a world that is sometimes dangerous and dark, it can be inspiring, and it can kind of lift our spirits as well.
It's interesting that you're right. We are in a world of anti-heroes, and a lot of our traditional heroes are being dismantled and taken down. And I'm thinking like the criticism of founding fathers for owning slaves and for being complicit in racism and slavery. And I think one reason people are so resistant to that is that they feel like any chink in the armor of their hero means that they've lost their hero, right? And if they've lost their hero, they've lost their true north. They've lost their orienting guidepost to help them live their lives. Like we need heroes. We need those stories to help us live our lives better as a society. And so one approach I think that's really useful, one model from history that I think could helpfully guide us today is the Roman historian, Greco-Roman historian Plutarch. And he's famous for putting Greek heroes in dialogue with Roman heroes. And so he was of Greek descent and Roman himself, but he didn't let any sort of nationalistic bias one way or the other. You know, he was Greek but a Roman citizen, bias how he wrote these stories. He would put two people in dialogue. For example, he put the Greek orator Demosthenes in dialogue with the Roman orator Cicero. And he just like went through their life stories and was like, you know, Cicero was kind of a jerk sometimes to his wives. So he gets a demerit. And he's like, Demosthenes was generous in XYZ circumstance. So he gets a check mark. And so he just goes down the line of their life story saying plus minus. It was very direct, very comparative. And he's a good storyteller and also historically rigorous. Like he was in the archives, like doing the dirty work of like getting rigorous. You know, he was good with his sources and things like that as well. And I think like we're uncomfortable doing that today, but I think because I'm not sure why. I need to think about that a little bit more, but what does it look like to become more comfortable with our heroes being flawed but still admirable at the same time? I think it's maybe we're in this black and white culture, but most of life is both and. Human beings are both and. We have good and bad,
Yeah.
all of us. But what does it look like to appreciate that? Um,
I think that would be helpful, but to your point, I mean, earlier, it's vital that people of a country have a shared narrative and a shared history,
mhm.
and when people are threatening, you know, the founding fathers and saying that they were bad, that erodes that. And you know, I think our story, I feel like our story is, you know, Thomas Jefferson's, we hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created equal, endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. And then I think you can fast forward to Dr. King and the promissory note. And
Mhm.
I think that, you know, Abraham Lincoln along the way, of course,
Mhm.
um, hearkening to Jefferson's writing as well as Dr. King. But so I think that is the ethos of America that is not only virtuous, but also um, encompasses pretty much everybody in the
Right.
American story. And so it's uniting. But unfortunately, I don't even know if that's enough or if that is acceptable. And I do think a lot of our problems today stem from us having multiple stories that don't necessarily comport.
I agree with you entirely. And I hope that it is enough because I think the story you just shared, the story of America, of um, capable of greatness, but flawed and a work in progress, that's the story of the human condition as well. And
Yeah.
that's how I define the human condition.
We, I think that's exactly right. Right. I just think as a human being, we live in a fallen world and we're going to mess things up, but you got to every day get up and try to do better. And that's a country.
Absolutely. And like we live in this era of strange perfectionism where we want to essentialize people to one feature of who they are, who they voted for, one mistake they've made, even if the mistake was decades ago. And it's so essentializing and reductive of the human spirit. It's degrading to just try and reduce us to one aspect of who we are, and how can we reclaim this a fuller, richer, more nuanced vision of personhood. I hope that maybe it's by everyone listening to this telling better stories of the greatness and wretchedness of man, as Blaise Pascal said. That's the stuff of the human condition, capable of greatness, also capable of wretchedness, both, not either or.
Well put. So I heard that you worked in government for a while, and then decided that wasn't your thing. Talk about that and what made you sort of decide to pursue something else.
So I was raised in an intellectually omnivorous home. Like my father was always telling us stories. There were always open books everywhere. And my parents kind of modeled and taught us that education wasn't something that happened in the classroom. It was a way of engaging with others in the world around us with curiosity and openness and wonder, and just having the disposition that everyone has something to teach us. And I loved school. I loved learning, but I also, again, brought with me this, just innate curiosity, wonderment of the world around me, and knew that my education, my true education happened, with at home with my parents, and also with my great courses. That's kind of why it's so fun to create a great courses teaching company Wondrium series now, because every birthday, every Christmas, my father would gift me with a new series on American history, Greek mythology, astrophysics, and that was a huge part of my education, like the backbone of my education. Again, all outside the classroom. And because I love learning so much, when I moved to Washington, D.C., September 2016, I was invited, soon after Donald Trump won, invited to take a role at the United States Department of Education. And I was thrilled. I was like, where else would I be? Of course, if there's an opportunity to serve in government, I would go to the Department of Education because I love education. I love it. And I could not have been more disillusioned or more wrong about what the Department of Education is or does. I realized that the Department of Education, the single largest institution in the history of mankind dedicated to student instruction, does not care about education. Not at least how I was educated or how I was brought up, how I was trained to view education, which is lifelong learning, wonderment of the world around us, cultivating curiosity, and pursuing beauty and goodness and truth. And education is soul craft and ordering loves. And the Department of Education moves money between bodies and pulls bureaucratic levers. And I was just so overwhelmed, simultaneously overwhelmed and underwhelmed, I would say. Overwhelmed by just learning, like navigating the arcane bureaucracy, and underwhelmed at just the how education had just become so reduced to just like grant making, and just there's no broader vision of what we're doing, which is crafting souls and cultivating humanity. That's what education is. It's supposed to be nurturing what is best in us and diminishing what is least, that what is worst in us as human beings. And I left after 1 year and dedicated myself to working on my book on civility, coming out with St. Martin's in October, and also just cultivating a community around the ideas that I just saw so painfully absent from our public life today, and especially at the Department of Education where I was. So pursuing beauty, goodness, and truth, reviving the wisdom of the past to help us lead better lives now. That's those are the defining kind of values of Civic Renaissance, my newsletter and intellectual community, and I wouldn't have it any other way. It was a very painful experience in government, but I think it was a necessary one. I'm trying to tell myself a story of redemption there. It's been hard, and I've done it. I've tried and retried. I've recrafted, recast that that early failure, and
Is there a version where you sick your dog on Betsy DeVos?
I haven't dabbled with that version yet. Maybe that's the sequel or something like that.
Well, I'm glad that you're here. And I think you made the right move. Tell us about this. I mean, we've been talking about it the whole time, but tell us about this. Is this part of the great, tell me about the project, and who are you affiliated with?
Okay, so the series is produced with by the teaching company. The teaching company is the parent company, and they were more often known as the Great Courses.
The Great Courses, yes, I've heard about this.
Absolutely. So they're the original masterclass. They've been in this business for 30 years, and the whole business model was going to the best classrooms, identifying the best teachers in America. And originally they would go to America's institutions and like film them in the classroom, teaching their whatever subject they were best known for or most passionate about. And then they started bringing talent to their Netflix-like studio just outside of Washington, D.C., by Dulles Airport. And now, in response to Netflix and Masterclass, they've rebranded their new streaming platform. Their Netflix-like platform is called Wondrium, and this is like their new brand of content that's less just cerebral, kind of pure academic content. So, like, I have a graduate degree, but I'm not a scholar. Like, I'm not a PhD, and so I'm not their traditional, old world. I'm not the kind of professor that I was raised on, like in their content. But I'm grateful that they're dabbling in these new avenues because it's a great opportunity to reach new audiences, younger audiences, and it invites people like me it allows people like me to talk about the ideas and the stories that I love. So this series called Storytelling and the Human Condition is in partnership with Wondrium, formerly the Great Courses. And it explores what great stories from across media, history, and culture tell us about what it means to be human and what it means to lead a meaningful life. And I think there's something in there for everyone. I really worked hard to kind of remedy my knowledge gaps growing up. We're all captive to the educations that we were given, but that's the best fun thing about lifelong learning. Like, we get to follow our interests. That's the best thing about how education can and should continue after school. We're not on anyone else's agenda anymore, anyone else's schedule. That's what's fun about your job, Matt. I asked you, like,
Yes.
how do you do 3 podcasts a week? That's exceptional work product output. And you're like, it's fun. I get to talk with cool people about cool things. Like, you get to keep learning. That's awesome.
Yeah, I've learned more. I guarantee you I've learned more since graduating from college by doing this than I did in college. And, like, on one hand, that makes perfect sense. But on the other hand, I think a lot of people quit. They graduate from school and they're out of the learning business.
Right.
They don't really learn anything else ever.
And
And
that's
for me, that's sad. And
it's sad because that's when your true learning should just begin.
yep.
And I think that's what any good education should do. That's what I aspire to in all my work. Like, nothing I ever write is going to be like the comprehensive, definitive XYZ treatment of civility or of storytelling, right? But I hope that what it does is awaken or reawaken a hunger to keep learning and growing in our wonderment and awareness of the world around us. That's the stuff of the good life. And that's kind of the thesis of the course, that all great works of art, movies, film, plays, novels, whatever it is, an actual painting, opera, sitcoms, they tell a story about what it means to be human, about the good life of, and that, encountering these stories, even if we don't agree with them, can help enrich how we view the world and enrich our lives as well. So that's a great aspiration of the series.
I even think, I wasn't susceptible to the charms of Donald Trump like a lot of my colleagues who are conservative like me. And I think some of it, if I'm being honest, some of it's like what my dad died before Trump came along. He very well might have become a Trumper, but the values he gave me would say no. Some of it's things I learned in church. Some of it's things I learned from my parents. Some of it, I think, is things I got from TV and movies, and not just trash TV, but like probably movies like Casablanca that teach about standing up against the crowd
Resistance.
or authoritarianism, being, I'm a Gen Xer, so like my whole generation is about not selling out and about being kind of contrarian and stubborn. And so I think some of those values were inculcated in me. Now, like, why me? Because I think a lot of Gen Xers probably were on the Trump train. I'm not sure what it was, but for whatever reason, I'm pretty confident that that movies that I consumed were one of the things that led me to my political decisions that I've made.
Of course, the stories that you consumed formed you. That's what's so interesting when you look at, for example, some of the stories I were raised on, in addition to my father's, were the Disney fairy tales. And in the process of creating this series, I was able to look into like the original stories that and those stories were Disneyfied, right? They were given happy endings when they were way gritty and did not have happy endings, right? Like, sorry, spoiler alert, guys, like the Little Mermaid died in the original Hans Christian Andersen rendition, or the Brothers Grimm that gave us Little Red Riding Hood and Rapunzel, like their Sleeping Beauty, like there's cannibalism, there's murder, there's rape, and all of these original stories, like they're gritty. And often they were the trend is they were intended for adults, but actually the Brothers Grimm, it didn't sell very well. The original book, they wrote of fairy tales for adults. So they started to kidify them over the subsequent editions, but they were still pretty gritty. They were still raw. And what they did was they gave kids an opportunity to kind of, as you said earlier, that kind of stories are role play. They're like an ability to like kind of try things out. So when there's an evil stepmother in the works, it's because women often died from childbirth, and that described the lived experience of men often remarrying, and the stepmother not loving her husband's kids as much as she loved her own. And there's that was a real dichotomy, a real lived experience, and it offered kids an outlet, like through resilience and wiliness and cleverness. That is how you're going to survive in this cruel and unfair world where you should be, cherished and adored and loved. But unfortunately, it's not the case in 18th century Germany or whatever. And of course, these stories were also told orally for many, many, many centuries before. And there were flavors in France, there were flavors in Italy, there were flavors all over Germany, and they were all slightly different. And the Grimm brothers came along and codified them for the first time. And those are often the definitive stories we think of now, but even those have many alternative endings as well.
Mm-hmm.
So what does it mean? This is a question I'm thinking about. When we Disneyfy these stories, are we incapacitated, or with, the Roald Dahl situation, when we neuter them, we're taking out the grittiness? Are we incapacitating our kids from the rawness of life when we only give them happy endings? Like, life is not going to be a happy ending.
What's funny is that Disneyfied stories, and then those Disney stories became canon to a lot of modern Americans. And then if you tried to change the Disney stories, we would be appalled.
Right.
Disney changed the stories, right? And so it could be that what's happening today is the product of, we have created a much safer world, and we have the luxury, we think we have the luxury of taking out, this person was fat. Oh, that might hurt somebody, so let's take that out. I don't think that a rugged America that is enduring serious economic strife or material strife makes that move. This is what a very comfortable society does, right?
Absolutely.
All right, we agree. So tell us, how could, if people want to learn more about storytelling, how can they sign up for this course? How can they sign up for your newsletter?
Thank you. So you can get the course for free, giving away a free month of Wondrium, and you can enjoy the course in that free month at alexandraohudson.com/story. And that's where you can sign up for Civic Renaissance as well. Would love to have you. And the book is The Soul of Civility, Timeless Principles to Heal Society and Ourselves, coming out October 10th with St. Martin. So get your copy now.
Yes.
While it's hot.
If you want to help an author,
Exactly.
the best thing you can do is pre-order the book. So do that now. Let me ask you about, when it comes to the course, is this something that people are just sort of watching a video, or is it interactive? How does it work?
Yeah, so it is a televisual product. So a lot of the Wondrium subscriber base, they watch this. Like, some people get home and watch White Lotus at night. Others get home and they watch a teaching company production, like my series. and so yeah, it is televisual, but it's also available on Audible. Wondrium has a partnership with Audible, so all their content is available there as well. And so I always consume my Wondrium content via Audible. I really like the platform. I like the app, and I have my Audible credits. And so, but Wondrium also has their own app that it's like Netflix. So like subscriber base, you pay, monthly for it, and can binge watch all that binge worthy content like mine. So subscribe there too.
Very cool. Did you watch what you said, White Lotus? Did you watch White Lotus?
I did. I watched both. The first season was terrible. And I think they were supposed to, I didn't feel like it felt as luxurious as Sicily. I liked watching the second season because it was just beautiful. Sicily, that felt like luxury and more aspirational to me. But it was so gritty. It kind of haunted me for several weeks almost after. Like all of it
Wow.
just felt really cringy, and it like grated my soul. I don't know. What did you think?
I thought season one was better. I
Really?
like season one a lot better. And I thought it was a really good commentary on race in America and cancel culture and sort of stuff like that. Like a lot of things that we're talking about today.
It was
Um,
conservative. I would say season one was very
I
conservative.
thought so too. Like not conservative like Edmund Burke, but conservative like Bill Maher is nowadays a conservative, right? It's conservative in that sense. I mean, the villain was a person of color who wanted to sort of have retributive, you know,
This.
ends, and the you had these. It was really everybody's a liberal, but you had these liberals who believed kind of in free speech versus um, woke. I would say like woke progressives who were they were spoiled though,
Hmm.
Um, so to me, I thought it was like a really smart commentary on our modern politics and on wealth as well. People who are rich and sort of uh, selfish and soft and all that.
I have to say, I'm sorry if this is spoiling the show for anyone, but I called that husband as a con artist. Like as soon as she met him, I was like, this is not going to end well.
She's too good for him. Let's be honest. It's Andrea Daddario you're talking about,
Yes,
right?
exactly. Her, yep.
Or are you talking about season one?
No, no, no. Yeah. So when she met, what is her name? The billionaire.
Oh, I know who you mean. I know who you mean. Right. The guy. This would be a big spoiler, but he turns out to be in season two, right? So this is the one character who's in season one and season two, right?
Maybe it's all the storytelling I consume, but I'm a good judge of
You
character,
saw that
and I
coming?
knew it. I saw that coming, right?
I did not see that
My
coming.
husband was like, "Nope, I think they're going to be okay," and I was like, "No, it's going to be bad." And we don't find out till like the last episode that of
Yes.
season two, like way later, that I was right. So you heard it here. I can't say first because
You remember when she saw the picture of him?
right,
Okay.
yep.
I apologize to listeners who've not seen it, and those who have as well. Let's plug the book one more time. How can people pre-order it?
It's called The Soul of Civility, Timeless Principles to Heal Society and Ourselves. And the key argument there is that there's a difference between civility and politeness. That politeness is etiquette, it's manners, it's the superficial, external norms. Civility is something deeper. It's a disposition of the heart. It's a way of seeing others as human beings, just like us, and beings with dignity and worthy of a baseline of respect. Sometimes being respectful to others, actually respecting them, requires being impolite, breaking norms of etiquette and politeness. Telling people when they're wrong, Matt, like when you're terribly wrong. I hope you were right this entire conversation so far, but you invited me to tell you when you were wrong because that's the respectful thing to do, rather than let someone go on and misguided, or just having robust debate, even
Yeah.
not just categorically saying you're wrong, but saying, actually, let's have a conversation about this, not papering over difference and sweeping difference under the rug. And the Latin root of these two words, civility and politeness, supports that. The Latin root of poliere is Latin root of politeness is poliere, which means to smooth or polish, and that's what politeness does. And the Latin root for civility is civitas or civis, which is related to all things citizenship and city, and that's what civility equips us to do. It gives us a skill set and a toolbox to do the stuff of citizenship and to engage in a democracy and a free society like our own. So that's a little quip for our little promo for the book. So thanks for inviting me here.
Well, thank you. It was a delight. I think it was a great discussion. A little esoteric for us, but I got to nerd out a little bit and I learned a lot. So everybody check it out. Go to alexandraohudson.com to find out and sign up for the course. And tell us the forthcoming book one more time.
The Soul of Civility, Timeless Principles to Heal Society and Ourselves.
Pre-order The Soul of Civility. Alexandra Hudson, thank you for coming on the news.
Thanks, Matt.